I'm obsessed by existence, being. Existence weakens my knees. Being knots my stomach. To me, existence is the only thing that science can never explain. Does this mean that there is a God? I wish it were that simple. Perhaps existence is just brute fact, without explanation. As atheist Bertrand Russell said, the universe is just there, and that's all. Yet some claim that God can be discerned from existence. Can we argue for God from being? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey to find out. Here's what enchants me. It's called the ontological argument for God. Ontology means being. And its chain of reasoning, deceptively simple, goes like this. If the most perfect being, God, can be conceived, then the most perfect being, God, must exist. Because a being that exists is more perfect than a being that is only conceived. When I first heard this argument, I thought it was a joke. When I realized the argument was serious, I thought, this is what gives philosophy a bad name. Yet, still it survives. Why? I begin at Notre Dame with a philosopher who believes in God, but who pillories weak arguments for God. Peter van Inwagen.
Peter, I've been fascinated by the ontological argument, which initially I thought was a joke, but I'd love you to explain it in its richness.
There are a lot of versions of it. One of them was devised by one Anselm. He put the argument this way. He said, well, imagine the fool in the Psalm, in the 14th Psalm, who says there is no God. He's just contradicting himself. That was the conclusion of the argument. A very strong sense, just as strong as the sense in which he would be contradicting himself if he said there is a God and there isn't one. But the contradiction is supposed to go like this. First of all, we must suppose he has the proper meaning for the word God. If he means by God something improper, like an old man who lives in the sky and shoots lightning bolts, he may be right to say there is no God. But the proper meaning for the word God is a something than which no greater can be conceived. All right, so what he's saying is a something than which no greater can be conceived exists. But wait, of course the thing exists in his own mind, in his own thought. What he's really saying, said Anselm, is a something than which no greater can be conceived does not exist in reality, external to the mind, not just in the mind, but in reality. Well, suppose that were right. Then he'd be saying that this thing just exists in his mind. And here's the contradiction. But then we could conceive of a thing greater than this something than which no greater could be conceived, namely the same thing or something just like it existing in reality. Because obviously it's greater to exist in reality than it is simply to exist in the mind. 500 years later or so, René Descartes gave a much simpler argument, and it was this. God, if we had the proper idea of God, we think of him as a supremely perfect being. And that means a being whose nature contains all perfections. But existence is a perfection. It's better to exist than not to exist. So God's nature must contain existence, but then his nature is inseparable from existence. Just as the nature of a triangle is inseparable from having interior angles that add up to 180 degrees, the nature of God is inseparable from existence. So you can't think of God as not existing. So when the atheist says God doesn't exist, he's contradicting himself because he's saying that a being that has existence as part of his nature does not exist, not a possible thing to say.
Now, one can think that that you can substitute anything for that definition of God and prove anything exists.
Descartes was well aware of that objection. Actually, he had two ultimate refutations. One went like this: you can't build existence into a concept because a concept is made of properties or attributes or qualities. Existence is rather all the features a thing has coming together in that one thing. And that's why you get the wrong result when you try to build existence into a concept and ask whether it's separable from the concept or not. You simply can't define it that way. Many people have said that necessary existence is contained in the concept of God, though they've said God doesn't exist. But then suppose we reason as follows, just parallel to what God said. Well, necessary existence is inseparable from God, so God exists necessarily. Well, anything that exists necessarily exists, so God exists. That doesn't commit the fallacy, if it is a fallacy of building existence into concept, but it seems to be invalid for the same reason.
Arguing for God from existence and being is one of the so-called classical proofs of God. But the ontological argument has been criticized as faulty logic dressed up in wishful thinking. Yet, I immersed myself in it, caught myself in its intricate web of subtle logic. Not once was I convinced that, therefore, God exists, but I remain captivated by our human strivings to find God. Is the ontological argument useful, supposedly showing that God, this greatest conceivable being, must exist? I go to Oxford to speak with a theologian, a former scientist, who does what he calls scientific theology, Alister McGrath. Alister, what about the ontological argument? An argument which is even more discredited in Christian thought, but frankly is stronger in Islam and strong in the Hindu religion. Is that something that is of importance?
It certainly is. You're quite right. This argument, and indeed many others, have fallen into disrepute. One of the reasons is they've been pressed far too far by well-meaning but over-enthusiastic theologians and philosophers.
But again, in other non-Christian religions, they are prominent.
They're very prominent, and indeed in Christianity they have a proper place as well. Let me give you an example. Anselm of Canterbury, back in the 11th century, who developed this argument, actually didn't see it as an argument at all. He simply said, look, if God really is there, then it follows that the thought of God is exceeded by the reality of God. Most people have this deep sense that there is something beyond them, a sense of the transcendent. Now here's the question, is that just arbitrary or a dream? Or is there something really there? And I'll tell you who I think is the most interesting exponent of the ontological argument today. It's J.R.R. Tolkien, the guy who wrote The Lord of the Rings. Back in 1931, he wrote a wonderful piece of writing called Mythopoeia, The Making of Myths. And he simply made the point, why do we dream? What's it all about? He says, look, who made us dream? And his argument is that the human capacity to imagine, to dream a better world is actually a signpost that such a better world exists and that there is one who makes us long to be in that world and to know what it's like.
But some have said, I can dream of a mermaid, and that doesn't make a mermaid exist.
Exactly. But the fact that I can dream dreams is saying something very significant about my longing for something that the world I see around me doesn't satisfy. Why did mariners dream of mermaids? Well, part of the answer is they had the sense there had to be more to life than what they actually saw, and they invented a world which they believed was better. Now, we can say they're wrong, but it's the impulse, this deep sense there is something more. Where's that coming from? Where does it take us?
There's not a day that goes by without my feeling the same thing. But I can't tell you that I feel that my longing, as meaningful as it is to me, gives me any comfort in knowing that that longing is suggestive of a reality that I would like to find. But I don't find my own longing compelling as to that existence.
No, and that's perfectly right. But there's another way of looking at this. Maybe this sense of longing is there to make us wonder, is what we see all that there is? Is there another world? Is there something beyond the horizons of our present knowledge, which is intimated to us but not fully given?
To dream and to wonder, yes, I do. We all do. But it is a long, long way from dreaming and wondering to the actual existence of the most perfect being. Is this it? The whole argument? Rather frail, no? A weak reed on which to lean one's hope for God. Yet the argument has beguiled philosophers for 1,000 years. There must be more. I've heard that in Islam, the concept of being is truly transcendent, more so than in Christianity. I go to Washington, D.C., to speak with one of Islam's most distinguished living philosophers, Seyyed Nasr.
In Islamic philosophy especially, being, which in Arabic is called wujud, plays a central role. Usually when you and I look at something, they say, that table is there, that tree is in the garden. We don't think about it anymore. We think that we have a kind of big cake of existence within which there are different pieces and different places. However, if you look at more deeply, the way your mind can understand and analyze this experience of the world out there, you can ask two fundamental questions. One is, does that thing exist or does not exist? And the other is, what is it? And these two questions are very distinct, because you can right now think of a pink cow in your mind, and the answer to the question, what is it, you can answer. But if you say, is it, you have to say no, because there are no external realities, it's only your mind. Or vice versa, you can ask whether something is or not without really inquiring about what it is. Now, outside, they're wed together. You never find separate essence, separate existence. But within the philosophical mind, it's possible to separate one from the other.
Does that distinction in Islamic philosophy help us to understand God or how God created the world more richly?
Very much so. A thing in itself has no existential effect. It doesn't exist. For example, right now, you ask, what is grapefruit? What is aspirin? But that aspirin cannot cure your headache. And that grapefruit you cannot have for breakfast. There has to be this element of wujud that has to be added to the quiddity, to the mahiyya, in order to existentiate it and enable it to have effect. Now, where does that come from? It doesn't come from the thing itself. And everything in the universe shares in this balanced equality between being or not being. That's called a possible being, a contingent being. Now, that's something which comes from the outside, then necessitates the existence of something. But everything is a contingent being. There's only one exception. Something whose very quiddity is being. So it could not be. That is the most powerful proof of the existence of pure being, which is God. That is the heart of this argument, the ontological argument. The things of this world, what we consider to be objects, have no being of their own, but receive being from something other than what defines in our mind what they are, gives an opening into accepting the being from which the existence or lower being of everything comes. By distinguishing between the quiddity of something and existence, which is added to that quiddity, you're already positing the reality, something outside of that, what we consider that object to be. It's whatness. This is the road that takes us to the realization of pure being, whose character it is to emanate, to give of itself, like light. It is the character of light to illuminate. And so if you discover that there's some light in this room, you will immediately say that must have a source. Because this chair is not by its nature luminous. So our intelligence, as soon as we say this chair is lit, is looking for the light which has lit this chair. And this is how being is seen in Islamic philosophy. So the very existence of you and I is proof that God is. In fact, the famous saying of Descartes, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, was answered by a great metaphysician by saying he should have said cogito or cogito ergo est, that is, I think, therefore God is. But the very fact that we're thinking beings who think is proof of that pure being, which enables us to exist.
God's essence is being. God exemplifies existence. God could not be. Being in Islam is pure and potent, crucial for demonstrating God, central for understanding God. But what about the Christian form of the ontological argument? Basically, that the most perfect possible being must exist. I need fresh perspective. It's time to speak with atheistic philosopher Michael Tooley. Michael has worked through the argument, and he does not end up with God.
Well, you're certainly right. It's been a tremendous revival of classical arguments, and the ontological argument is one that has some very strong advocates today. And I think that the fundamental objection to the ontological argument can be developed on the basis of an objection put forward by a contemporary of Anselm named Galileo. And what Galileo argued was that if you look at the ontological argument, you can simply by replacing the idea of a perfect being by the idea of a perfect island, show that there must be a perfect island or there must be a perfect beer and so on, right? Now, these are happy conclusions, right? And one looks forward to encountering these things. But the problem is that the argument can also be paralleled to drive contradictions, right? And so you can prove, for example, that there's a perfectly immovable object and that there's a perfectly irresistible force. Or you could use it to prove that there was a perfectly good being and a perfectly evil being, both of whom were omnipotent, omniscient, right? Which is again a contradiction.
So your view would be that this ontological argument, this search for a perfect being that must exist, lends itself to natural contradictions that are logically necessary that come from it, which falsifies the argument.
Yes, you can form concepts which are completely parallel, just involve substitution, and run the same sort of argument, and you get contradictory conclusions.
Michael's critique is short and sharp. A contradiction in an argument is a defeater of that argument. So is the ontological argument for God defeated, dead? To philosophers, the argument is theological paleontology, an intellectual fossil. Well, here's the surprise. The ontological proof of God, long declared dead, lives again. How is this possible? It concerns the nature of necessity, defining something to be necessary if it exists in all possible worlds. What are possible worlds? I'm back in Notre Dame with the leading Christian philosopher, Alvin Plantinga. I ask Al how possible worlds has transformed the ontological argument.
The way Anselm put it, the argument went something like this: God is by definition the being than which none greater can be conceived. Now, a being is greater if it actually exists than if it doesn't exist. So suppose the being than which none greater can be conceived didn't exist. Then we could conceive a greater one which was just like that being, but really existed. So it must be that the being than which none greater can be conceived exists. That particular way of putting it, Anselm's way, doesn't really work, I would say, because it suggests that you could compare a thing that didn't exist with a thing that did with respect to greatness. But the fact is there aren't any things that don't exist. I mean, all the things there are exist. So you can't really compare a non-existent thing with a thing that exists. But now you can put this argument in terms of possible worlds instead. So you can say, it's possible that there be a greatest possible being. And one initially thinks, well, yeah, I guess maybe there could be. A greatest possible being, what would such a being be like? Well, it would have to be a being that's omniscient and omnipotent and wholly good, maybe some other things as well. And if it's a greatest possible being, it would have to be such that it isn't merely that way in actuality, but would have been that way had things been different. So it would have to have these properties, but have them essentially, and in fact have them necessarily, that is, have them in every possible world. A possible world, first of all, is a way things could have been. Things could have been different in lots of ways. For example, you and I might not have been talking here together now. And a possible world is a way things could have been, a total way things could have been. So it says something about everything, you know. And one of the ways things could have been is the way things actually are. That's the actual world. Well, possible worlds help us think about what it is for a proposition to be necessary, or for an object to have a property essentially or necessarily. So a proposition is necessary just if it's true in every possible world. So suppose it's possible that there is a greatest possible being. That means that in some possible world, there is a greatest possible being, right? Now, in that possible world in which there is a greatest possible being, the following proposition is necessary. There is a being who exists in every possible world and is omnipotent and omniscient and the like in every possible world. In that world, that's necessary. But what's necessary doesn't vary from possible world to possible world. The very same things are necessary in all the possible worlds. The very same things are possible too in all the possible worlds. Therefore, that means that in every possible world, it's necessary that there is a being that has these properties and has them essentially. And if it's true in every possible world, then it's true in the actual world. So the fact is, it's necessary that there is a being who is omnipotent, omniscient, and wholly good in every possible world. And that's God.
This you've defined as the modal ontological argument. And how has that fared over the years?
Unlike the original, there aren't any logical problems with it. It actually does work. So if you believe the premise, if you believe it's possible that there is a greatest possible being, you're committed to there being a greatest possible being. I think there is general agreement on that. Where the argument has been criticized is that the distance between premise and conclusion is not all that great. I mean, once you see how this works, once you see how possibility and necessity works, then you're going to ask, if you don't like the conclusion, you're going to say to yourself, well, I mean, why do I have to say it's possible that there is a greatest possible being? Maybe that's impossible. If you do think it's possible that there be something like God as traditionally conceived of, then you're committed to there actually being such a thing.
Existence is most mundane and most profound. Is existence necessary? Must there be existence? Obviously, there is existence, but could it have been otherwise? Was it ever possible for there to have been no existence? I'm co-editing a book, The Mystery of Existence, Why Is There Anything at All? And still, truly, I do not know. I marvel how human beings reach to find God. I feel the pull. But please, it's ludicrous to try to prove that God exists with subtle definitions of perfection and necessity. It's not a matter of logic. It's a matter of common sense. If there is a God, God should not depend on games with words and tricks of argument. I push Peter van Inwagen.
You can't think of God as somebody who simply happens not to exist. Everything else that doesn't exist, at least in the concrete world of causation that we have around us, might not have existed. God would be unique in that if he doesn't exist, it's because he can't possibly exist, and if he does exist, he couldn't possibly not exist.
This is startling. the problem of God's existence solved only on the extremes. Either God does not exist because God cannot possibly exist, or God does exist because God cannot possibly not exist. Wow. One or the other is necessary. Either God's existence or God's non-existence must be true. How's that for closer to truth?
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.